evening and welcome to Nightlight. I'm Barb DeLong, your host. I invite you to step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can ever guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone. I'm really excited about tonight and tonight's guest because he's somebody that I actually know. And so often I interview people that have written books, and I've met them online when I was talking to them, but I've actually met this man, both of them actually, but I only have one of them here, which is fine. Tonight we have author Jim Vieira on, who along with co-author Hugh Newman has written a new book. Highly I recommend it. I can't tell you how highly I recommend it. It's called Giants on Record: America's Hidden History, Secrets in the Mounds and the Smithsonian Files. It's a spectacular book. It is not just a compilation. It is a book that gives you all sorts of different philosophies for how and why things happened, and it postulates lots of different suggestions, and it sets you to thinking like crazy. Jim is a stonemason, a researcher, and a writer. And he's an amazing writer. Actually, I have one of his articles on my website under Secrets of the Stones because he said stuff so much better than I could have. As well as exploring and writing about the stone sites of New England, he's collated over 1,500 newspapers and scholarly accounts of giant skeletons being found in North America and around the world. He's written for ancient American magazines, The Heretic, which is in the UK, and local Massachusetts newspapers. In 2012, he created the online blog, The Daily Giant, which showcased the Giant Report every day for nearly 2 years. And he is the star of the History Channel TV shows Search for the Lost Giants, that's 2014, and Roanoke, Search for the Lost Colony, 2015, with his brother Bill. He's an amazing man, and I can't tell you how excited I am to have him on the show. Jim, welcome to Nightlight.
Thank you, Barbara. That's quite an intro. I appreciate all the kind words. Very nice.
Well, it's really amazing. So many, you do bring the esoteric into the element of the giants, and I do mostly the spiritual stuff, but I've had a fascination with giants for a very long time. And I have a lot of reports on my website to sort of chronicle the fact that the bones have been out there for a long time. But it was really basically in the 1800s that most of the bones that we have newspaper articles on and such, that those are the reports that we have that kind of chronicle them and tell us that they were out there.
Yes, starting in the early to mid 1800s, you had a wide variety of reports all around the country, and anthropological, archaeological bulletins, town and county histories. And then in the late 1800s, the Smithsonian's Eastern Mounds Division had its scientists start unearthing skeletons in the eastern half of the country, and a lot of those reports came back, well over 7-foot skeletons over and over again, quite a few. Just enormous skeletons were reported, along with actually in 1873 a 36-inch circumference skull and other large skulls from a burial mound, and several of those were reported as crumbling to dust when they were exposed to the air, which is unfortunate. So we get into that in the book. At first blush, you would say, oh, there's a big conspiracy here and the Smithsonian's involved. And when I first started researching this controversial subject, that was my impulse, because I don't have a lot of trust for institutions, for governmental institutions, for there's a lot of agenda and there's a lot of sociopathic behavior that CEOs and other people engage in. So I was like drawn into this kind of controversial take on the subject. But taking a step back, I see it more as a mystery that's never been addressed by the Smithsonian. And it'd be nice to, get an official statement on what all the scientists' measurements mean. But, you know, at the end of the day, it is a fascinating historical mystery.
Well, yeah, and so many the fables and stuff talk about giants being huge but stupid. And when you look at the size of these skulls, and you have to assume that there was a brain in that skull, that they must have been highly intelligent.
Yeah, I try to, how do I express this? This whole experience for me has been really kind of fascinating and disconcerting to look at human behavior and psychology. What I found is that so many people are wedded to some agenda that instead of looking at something objectively, it's like, okay, I have a theory and I'm going to do everything I can to prove this theory, and I'm going to preclude information that doesn't support my theory, and I'm going to attack anyone who says anything wrong about my theory. And I see a lot of true believers that don't really think critically and logically and reasonably oftentimes. And then I see a lot of entrenched skeptics who have their own agenda. And it's like religion and politics, and they're totally unwilling to meet in the middle or to give anything. Like if I give the littlest piece of information, then I am agreeing with creationists who believe the earth is 5,000 years old or something, So I've had to kind of burn everything to the ground and start from scratch, doing my own research and trying to put together theories, but not really have an agenda, And with the book, I think you can see there's really a stunning historical mystery here. The way you have specific measurements over and over again, and these are stationary objects, and these reports are buried in respected town and county histories by respected historians. Oftentimes, it just doesn't make logical sense that it's some kind of hoax. Uh, and to your point, that yes, you have myths and legends of ogres and giants who are morons or whatever, and then you have other kind of mystical accounts of like survivors of a great flood who travel the world and repromulgate civilization. There's all these myths and legends tied around the idea of giants, and I don't know why, but it's part of the collective imagination or unconscious.
Well, part of my fascination with the giants and the chambers, as a matter of fact, is that they have been ignored, both of them, the chambers and the giants. And the more I read and the more I discovered, and certainly I've read a couple of books on the giants, more than a couple probably. I think yours is the best, though. I really do, because you not only don't say this is the way it is. You say this is one theory, this is another theory, this is another theory, this is another theory. And in some way, shape, or form, you can actually weave all of them together. And what fascinates me is that they have been here for so much longer than anybody realized. And I think that in the 1800s, when bones were dug up, it was, whoa, look at this, I can put it over my head, let me take it home for a souvenir. And no real research was done on them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And that's one thing that caught my attention is that, some of these reports are, people putting the skull on like a helmet or the jawbone over the face, but it is littered in obscurely in all these documents. And then I started to uncover them. I'm like, how can they be reporting the same thing all around the country? That's clearly indicating an enormous human skeletal structure. And that's what caught me. And because the kind of prevailing idea is that they're misidentified mastodon bones or hoaxes. And the more I dug in, I found not really misidentified remains. I found some hoaxes, some exaggerations, some mismeasurements, but oftentimes, at the end of the day, at the end of the investigation, I walked away saying, um, "Wow, I'm really, cannot count this out as a reality over and over again." So
No,
yeah,
and the indigenous, the native people that we speak of have legends of the giants, and so one has to think, okay, so the giants were here before the Native Americans were here, and then you
yes, yes,
then you start looking at this stuff and you think, what, 20,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, some of the carbon datings that you provide and some of the thing in areas in your book are mind-boggling, and so it's sort of, you do mention it, and I kind of, am kind of embracing the thought that the giants really migrated or came from this particular continent, and they had to be. I mean, let's face it, in every generation there are dumb and there are brilliant, but it feels to me as though, especially when you see on the West Coast, the Catalina Island and the Santa Rosa stuff, those 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 giants there were buried with respect and with dignity. And some of them, I mean, some of those sites are just so old that they don't fit into any current knowledge or sequencing for what our history is. It's where the kids are taught in school. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He hit this coast, and the Native Americans were the only people here. And then you go into the giant stuff, and the giants had to have been here before that. And the way some of the burials are, I mean, they had to be highly developed. Some of the implements and things that are buried with these bones are phenomenal.
well, you have two stories. One would be that there was a royal class of extremely tall Native Americans, like the Adena people in the eastern half of the country, several thousand years ago. Their rulers elongated their skulls. The women were often over 6 feet tall. The men 7 foot and taller, particularly robust, large skeletal structure, not like a skinny NBA player. And there are several over 7 foot finds in the 1950s by university trained anthropologists Webb, Snow, Dragoo that I
Mm-hmm.
talk about in the book. And the other story is that there was the oral traditions of many Native American tribes and many indigenous people all around the planet, but I'll stick with the Americas, is, that in the late Pleistocene times, probably before 12,000 years ago, 13,000 years ago, they all described, essentially a race of giants that were oftentimes portrayed as malevolent and cannibalistic. And it's just these strange tales. It's like, the more I dig into Native American oral traditions, the more I see that, they predicted geological events 12,000 years ago, tsunami frequency, the Pacific tribes in the Northwest coast. They really, oral histories all around the planet. The Aborigines in Australia, there's a new report out about their understanding. I don't know the specifics of it, but essentially science has ascertained that they understood what happened 12,000 years ago as far as some sea level changes. So you have, this kind of library in the ethers of indigenous wisdom, and they're all saying the same thing, that there was an ancient cataclysm around 12,000 years ago. Giant people existed in the past. Little people existed in the past. They often talk about a lost continent in the Atlantic, and the debunker can, deride that, but it's really, I don't know, it's really challenges you to think that all these indigenous people who had no contact share the same stories. It's fascinating. You get into Carl Jung, the collective unconscious, the holographic nature reality. I don't know what, I can't put my finger on it. I could just give you my take.
Hmm.
Uh, but it's quite a compelling thing that all these traditions are saying the same story. And
Well, I have come to believe that what in a great many cases, what comes down to us as legend or fable is actual reality, that they've lost the facts that substantiate it, so it just becomes a story that you scare kids with. And when it comes to the giants, they were all over this country. They were in many cases, especially in the Ohio Valley, the mounds that were there had giants buried in them in sitting positions, and the artifacts were phenomenal.
yes, you have reports from. This is the thing that grabbed my attention. For anybody to say this isn't an interesting mystery, or it doesn't deserve further investigation, is being disingenuous. They either haven't done their homework, or their agenda, frankly, is just to be an a-hole and to run their
Mm-hmm.
mouths. Because at the end of the day, if you look some of these reports, 1897, the head of the Smithsonian Anthropology Department, Thomas Wilson, verifies this 8 foot 1.5 inch skeleton from Miamisburg. It's in the book. There's a hand drawn sketch of it, and he says the authenticity of the skull is beyond doubt. It's basically categorized as one of the biggest skeletons ever found in history, next to like Charles O'Brien and the Irish Giant. But 8 foot 1.5 inches, verified by the head of the Smithsonian. Then you have also, I think it was 1897, the head of Carnegie, W.J. Holland, a paleoanthropologist. He unearths an over 8 foot skeleton between 8 and 9 feet at the McKees Rocks Mound in Pennsylvania. It's in Scientific American. In the
Mm-hmm.
20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, you have the head of geology department, Walter B. Jones at Arkansas, Alabama. You have Byron Cummings, the head of the archaeology department of Arizona, the dean of Southwest Archaeology. Forrest Clements, head of anthropology, University of Oklahoma, on and on and on, documenting 7 foot and taller skeletons. Byron Cummings, over 8 foot skeletons that were destroyed in the Sonora chapter. I talk about it, destroyed by the Yaqui Indians when they smashed them with the rifle butts.
Mm-hmm.
And a skeptic would say, oh, show me the bones. And isn't it, convenient that, bones get smashed and bones disappear? And I would say, if you read all these accounts, there are so many that are on display. The town's abuzz. They're in like some, the county clerk's office or something like that. All these people who respect it, verify it. And without physical evidence, you can't say, oh, this is a reality. But you can say this is a strange mystery. And if you don't believe it, what is your story? What is your view on this? And I don't get a lot of really coherent views. I get like insults or dismissiveness, when the reality is like, set your agenda aside and look at this from a historical detective's viewpoint.
Yeah, and what gets to me is, I there have been battlefields that have been uncovered that are hundreds slash thousands of skeletons that, when the railroads went through, they just basically threw the bones to the side. There was such a casual attitude towards unearthing bones that for some reason, it may have made the newspaper or not. And it's sort of like, in this country, we as a group, um, think about antiquity, and we look to Egypt, Rome, and Greece, and we don't realize, and we don't pay attention to the antiquity that's here in this country that could even be older than Egypt, Rome, and Greece. It's just that it hasn't been chronicled yet.
Yeah, well, I think one of the problems was that when the colonists came here, the Native Americans were essentially in the way, and they were heathens, and there was a lot of conversion religion going on, and a lack of respect for the spiritual practices of Native peoples that were, in my opinion, much more sophisticated uh, than the horde that came over, basically the white plague that
Mm-hmm.
spread, and it's just the way it is that uh, kind of a proof that Native American culture has been marginalized is the fact that we just don't know anything in schools about taught in schools about the mound builders and all the incredible geometric forms and earthen pyramids and earthen mounds that are all around the eastern half of the country. Many of that destroyed, but Cahokia, 100-foot tall earthen pyramid with the 14-acre base,
Right.
still there in Collinsville. Yeah, the geometric forms in Ohio, just stunning octagons and circles that predict eclipses. We talk about that in the book. Just this amazing Native American engineering projects and culture, and basically, they had their issues, but they were pretty solid across the board for about at least 12,000 years, being stewards of the land and keeping their act pretty together. And then we've come over in 400 years and poisoned the waters and the shit we've done. All you got to do is travel through any like city or the Rust Belt or something like that. And you just shake your head. It's just like that Indian or the Native American in the 70s that would cry with the Litter commercial.
Oh,
Remember that?
yes.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. And that's the film. And people get it. It's just like, hey, our culture sucks. We need to like change direction. It is. It's just Vampire Academy. Everybody's got weird agendas. Everybody's trying to everybody's looking for a hit instead of like turning your life around and having a more metaphysical, spiritual look at things, a more compassionate look at reality. So that's why they looked to the past to like, I am seeking to identify with civilizations that did it right, that worked communally, that had spiritual practices that were for the good of all, or religious practices for the good of all, not selfish, weird, dogmatic nonsense that you find in organized religion oftentimes, but like an orientation for the good of all life forms.
Well, yeah, and I mean, if you go back in history, look at the Iroquois. Their nation was huge, and they had huge cities, and they had pyramids, and um, it probably had kind of gone down a bit before the colonists got here. But I mean, on top of the fact that the colonists looked upon them as very barbaric and obviously not educated, uh, the colonists also brought all of the diseases with them. So, we wiped out most of them with the diseases that they brought over from the motherland. Um, but one of the things, I mean, you have to admit that there were giants here, and they were all over the place here. Not only here, but in South America and up in Canada. And once you accept the fact that there are giant bones here. I mean, the cave in Nevada where they found all of the bones of the giants that the Navajo had
Paiute.
Paiute
Mm-hmm.
um, had sort of destroyed. Yeah, all of the Indian legends speak of the tall ones or the giants. And if they were here and they fill one of those slots in our history that has been sort of left blank because we don't know what was going on here, if we accept the fact that they were here, and I do believe they were, I mean, there's just no question to that. Next question is where they come from.
Um, yeah, the current anthropological theory is out of Africa. Australopithecus evolved into, you know, um, ancestors like Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, and then Neanderthals and the Denisovans were our cousins, essentially, who we interbred with about 40,000 years ago in Denisova Cave in Siberia. Uh, in the land bridge theory is that humans, eventually made it here, excuse me, roughly 15,000 years ago. And there's debate about that, about the Clovis barrier. The ice bridge allowed Siberians to come through, and then peoples, North and South America. For me, there has to be um, anthropological, like an anthropological link. Where do they come? Is the question. With the Denisovans, 40,000 years ago. I mean, 40,000 years old is the Denisovan finger bone. I think they found in Denisova cave. So,
Yeah.
anyways, the two teeth they found, and they're both enormous, and they're as big as a. They thought it was a cave bear's tooth, and they took it to the Max Planck Institute and found it was a new hominid species, which was fascinating. And it interbred with humans and Neanderthals, and it interbred with the species X that they know exists, and they have no anthropological evidence for it. So my question is, the Denisovans with these enormously large teeth, they of giant stature, is the species X that interbred with humans? Is this has some part of our past, that caused giant people to be part of our population? Lee Berger in South Africa, he's a professor. He just made a stunning find of Homo naledi, naledi, I'm sorry, at the Rising Star cave system from near Johannesburg, and it's I think it's part Australopithecine. But anyways, it's like it's piecing together the story of human evolution. But he talks about uh, Homo heidelbergensis, a South African strain we talk about in the book, but that he says they have bones that clearly indicate an over 7 foot population that branched off from Homo heidelbergensis in Germany and other places. So he's talking about a period of gigantism about 150, 200,000 years ago. Uh, and they just found off the coast of Taiwan recently, fishermen about 60 feet out found a really huge human jawbone. And once again, that is indicating exceptionally large species of hominid, And we have in 2003, I believe, the hobbits on Florensis, Homo floresiensis showing up. That's a 3 foot tall creature, basically. So you have all these anthropological mysteries, and I'm not just going to say, "Oh, this is a reality." You got to, It's for me. It's more like, um, I just I want to be objective and say I understand where science is coming from, but I look from a different perspective. I look from a esoteric, mystical perspective. I try to take in oral traditions and other sources and just and align them with science to try to draw a conclusion. So I'm open-minded. Science will give us some of our answers. I don't need the guys in this constant battle back and forth. It's more like believe what you believe. I am trying to solve a problem by looking at things holistically, kind of the end.
Well, it's I totally, and it isn't that these were people that had that gigantism deformity. These are perfectly formed human beings that are huge. And they were talked about in the Bible. There were tons of tribes of giants in the Bible, and almost, if you go to the Native American Indians, almost all of them have they've got fables, they've got histories, they've got stories of floods and the tall people coming and helping them and teaching them, and in some places you talked about how the tribes did natural selection with breeding to try to breed for larger and larger and larger people. And personally, just my opinion with no scientific background, it feels to me as though they are very much like those people who tried to wrap their children's heads to make them larger so that they resembled another subspecies, side species of human. I feel that perhaps the Indians in their selective breeding were trying to recreate something that they had from their past and they lost.
Yeah, that's an interesting hypothesis. I would say I've thought of the same thing. What you're talking about is skull elongation
Mm-hmm.
with the head binding, and that's a very interesting anthropological mystery. And once again, it doesn't get addressed. I just feel that, you know, there's academic filtration that happens, that I really just think things get pushed out of the way because they've been left to languish as ideas that are unscientific or kooky or was fringe, if you will. So they
Yeah.
haven't got the investigation they deserve. And sometimes that causes wild theories to pop up that have no basis in reality, don't have a lot of credibility. But sometimes legitimate questions are left behind. And I think all around the planet you have tribes elongating their skulls, and it's like,
Hmm.
are they emulating something? And why would you do such a bizarre and strange thing to your child? Uh, and how could it be known about all around the world? France and Paracas, Peru, and everywhere you find this in the Americas, all around the planet, this strange behavior. And like
Yeah,
you
but
said, with giant people, is it some kind of inbreeding, like this memory? Uh, Personally, I grew up Catholic. I am uh, not Catholic at this point. I would consider myself kind of spiritual, but
mhm.
not religious. So I don't have a vested interest in saying that. It's very odd that the Bible has all these accounts, like you said, and they talk about specifically like the giant of Gath. I think it's Samuel 21:20 had 6 fingers and 6 toes, and you have these legends of giants with 6 fingers and 6 toes, and you have petroglyphs all around the Southwest and other places with like giant hands and feet with 6 fingers and 6 toes, and it's just an odd thing, and you could just dismiss it all out of hand and have a one line, they show me the bones or something like that. But it's like that's not really addressing the larger story here, how it can be embedded in so much of our most important religious documents, historical documents. The early explorers, the Spanish and English explorers, over and over again reported 7, 8, and 9 foot tall people from Patagonia
Mhm.
to up Florida, and so it's a compelling mystery.
Well, the six fingers and six toes and the double rows of teeth, and you left out the red and auburn hair and the fair complexion. Um, that's been repeated over and over and over and over again, and it's interesting because when Patrick and I did a show on this on Matrix Radio, we had a woman call in who was sure that she was related to one of the tribes in Ireland because all of her family had the red hair, the fair skin, the six fingers and six toes, and the double rows of teeth. I personally know someone whose family the double rows of teeth, the six digits on hands and feet, um, run in the family. So it feels to me as though genetically speaking, that certain aspects of giants have come down into today. And genetically speaking, I think there has to be a connection to the giants. It's not it's not a deformity. It's just something that runs in certain family lines, and you have to almost assume that there had to be a source for that particular gene.
Yeah, yeah. It's just it's the strangest thing I got to say that there are these
It
consistent anatomic anomalies get talked about, and
it would be interesting to do some sort of a study to to take people that have had these aspects within their own lives and follow the family line back to see if it was something that you could trace back to or look for that the X group, the haplogroup.
haplogroup X. Uh, yeah, there's a lot of advances in mitochondrial DNA research, genome sequencing that are giving us a lot of answers. So once again, uh, science will provide a large part of answers to our questions, but not all. I just kind of think science has lost its spirit somewhat, and doesn't always look at things from a holistic perspective. And
Well, Well, there's, you did put out one other theory that I thought was phenomenal, and that was the CO2 theory, the pre-flood, that there was a larger degree of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which made plants grow bigger. And theoretically, if it made plants grow bigger, perhaps it made people grow bigger as well.
That's another interesting twist. And Native Americans will point to the late Pleistocene era, well, once again as this time when there were giant people on the earth. So you have, say, you 15,000 years ago, you have stegodons, you have giant sloths, giant beavers, huge megafauna and megaflora, and certainly you have small humans that existed. We know that from the fossil record, but were there larger humans? And then that's when the Bible talked about like a malevolent group of giants was killed, and the Great Flood happened, and that's when Atlantis. Plato talked about Atlantis being
Mm-hmm.
destroyed about 12,000 years ago. Edgar Casey talks about that, and the honest truth is that all throughout human history, different civilizations have thought that they had all the answers scientifically, but things keep progressing, and there's that kind of arrogance carries over, like we have all the answers, but uh, they've been predominantly wrong over and over again. And now, what does our current society and its scientific establishment have wrong? It's simple as that. What is it that I think we missed? That I think there was, or I believe, like Graham Hancock talks about, I think around 12,000 years ago, there was a cataclysm and a cometary impact. And you look at a site like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, it's a sophisticated megalithic complex, and it's 12,000 years old. And that would have been completely unthinkable, say, 20, 30 years ago. And there are things that we've missed or have been precluded for some reason. And that's all I'm asking is like, what, in 50 years, we're going to look back and what did science miss? Oh, there wasn't,
Well,
it,
with
yeah.
with Göbekli Tepe, that site was intentionally buried as though to protect it. So it would seem to me, at least that's what I read.
Yeah.
And if that was the case, then they must have known that there was a cataclysm of some sort coming, which again, that goes back to the fact that they had to know the stars. They had to have a better understanding of the cosmic atmosphere, and be able to predict what was going to be coming, because it seems to me that before the flood there was, what did they call it, the younger,
Younger dries
yeah, impact,
impact.
where there was a horrific amount of impact from meteorites and meteors and stuff like that, that changed the atmosphere. And in changing the atmosphere, that's kind of, it goes along with the fact that at one point possibly the Earth had a double atmosphere, and that was what allowed a lot of the dinosaurs that theoretically couldn't get off the ground to actually fly.
Yeah, yeah, that's it's really a good point that you look back at history, and it was such a bizarre place about 15,000 years ago, 14,000 years ago. Once again, the late Pleistocene era, and it completely changed. There was a cataclysm that just swept, mastodons and mammoths, like basically, I don't want to be long-winded, but there was like an earth-shattering cataclysm that happened that reformed the whole earth. No
Mm-hmm.
question in my mind. All the Native American tribes talk about it. They talk about their ancestors escaping to the mountaintops, whether it's here in the Northeast, Mount Washington, or Mount Rainier, or Mount Hood, or Mount Ararat in Turkey. It's the same story all around the world. Not just like, like a kind of a flood of the Mediterranean, but a cataclysmic, mind warping flood of biblical proportions, if you will. And I really believe that we're a species with amnesia. If you have an interest in this subject matter, I would pick up Graham Hancock's book, Magicians of the Gods, his newest one, which is excellent. And like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, once again, it's 12,000-year-old massive megalithic temple site. Uh, it was used for 1,000 years, and then it was purposely buried, as you said. And the oldest enclosures at the site are the most sophisticated, that Graham points out, indicating that these hunter-gatherers who were organized to build this, um, why would their work get worse over the next 1,000 years? Was it that they were guided by survivors of the flood, like you have the legends everywhere all around the planet, uh, guided to kind of re-promulgate civilization? It's a very interesting theory, and once again, I would say, 50 years into the future, how are we going to look back at what we're talking about now? What is going to be proven to be accurate and what isn't? And I just, that's why it's worth being open-minded about these things and not being an idiot, because, we don't have all the answers. We can make some logical guesses. And I say, on both sides of the aisle, there are, well, once again, there are true believers who don't think critically. And that's why, I mean, I took my Facebook account out back and shot it like 2 years ago. I have no internet presence. I find it a wasteland of diversion and nonsense. And of course, there are good things. It's relative, but I just, for somebody who is invested in kind of spiritual evolution, I find just uh, sitting in silence is much better than being on the internet and being diverted. And I just find there's so much nonsense, and my head wants to explode. And then on the other side, there is a lot of academic arrogance. There are trolls and debunkers who have an agenda. They're not looking to find the truth out. They're just looking to belittle someone. So you have people who really need to move in a different direction on both sides. That's my conclusion.
Well, that sounds like a good conclusion. I would tend to agree with you for the most part, because being on a spiritual journey is one of one's self-awareness, and two is truth. And you look at the giants and it's a question mark. I mean, they were here. They were huge. If you go to, did you ever look at the Brighton Wiener cave thing that Patrick had up on his website, the cave in Bavaria, that in 15 something, a whole members of the town went and investigated the cave, and they found huge bones and altars and all sorts of stuff there. There's material out there. I think that they're laughing on the other side, because it's kind of like, well, all the pieces are there. Why can't they put them together? And it's a matter now of the fact that there are so many theories. You don't know what is the truth and what isn't, and you have to keep fitting the pieces together until they dovetail in perfectly. So that there is continuity, and for me, there was I know as far as timeway and timeline goes, I know that there are pieces missing in our understanding of our species on this planet. And you can't tell me that we went from cavemen to Indians. I mean, obviously there were giants in there someplace. How do the giants figure into the evolution of Homo sapiens? Because they look like Homo sapiens. If you look at the Toth material, theoretically, and that's the Atlanteans. The Atlanteans were theoretically giants, because they talk about little men and then the Atlanteans. And it's kind of like, okay, so where did they come from? I mean, did they evolve on this planet? I don't think I buy that extraterrestrials planted them here. I think they're part of our evolution, and I'm not sure how they fit in, but they absolutely do fit in, because I know people that have attributes that have been, attributed to giants.
Yeah, I'd say that somebody for me who is kind of proven to be a good source of information is Edgar Cayce, the mystic,
Mm-hmm.
called the Sleeping Prophet. He had over 14,000 readings and 25 million words documented at the ARE Library in Virginia Beach.
Mm-hmm.
He lived in the early part of the 19th century, and I've just read through so much of his stuff, and he would go into a trance state and basically tap into the universal records, if you will, and he would tell these stories, or he would do health readings for most people.
Mm-hmm.
Then one day he was talking about a past life of someone, and he started talking about Atlantis, and then he got asked more and more questions eventually, and told this kind of alternative history, and he talked about the mound builders, and he talked about uh, that part of the population of Atlantis was well proportioned beings who were 10 to 12 foot tall, and little people who existed there also. And Rudolf Steiner said the same thing. And then the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons also talk about that in their literature, and this connection with giants being part of the lost colony of Atlantis. And it sounds like, oh, that's so strange, that's so odd, or that's, unthinkable, whatever. But they're all independently saying the same thing, along with, once again, oral traditions. And it's just the oddest thing that you would have these, like, if somebody will land on this planet and you would talk to like indigenous people or comparative mythologists, you would have this totally different view of what this planet and species was all about than what the conventional wisdom is. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a justification. If you study anthropology and archaeology, you will be moved in that direction to believe the anthropological record is this way,
Mm-hmm.
archaeology is this way. Change is very slow, but there's a story behind the story. It could be genetic intervention. Um, Something's going on.
Oh,
There's
well,
certainly, yeah.
if you look at the haplogroup X, um, Casey talks about a lot of the survivors of Atlantis going to the east coast of the Americas here, and that's where the
Yeah.
largest selection. That's where the large proportion of the haplo X group, um, are found with the Indians that were in this area, and the other places where the survivors of Atlantis, were theoretically went to. That there are other groups here. I think Ireland was another one of the groups where Atlantean survivors went. So that haplo X group comes up again and again and again. And 20 years ago, Atlantis was a great fairy tale. I'm now beginning to think that it's much more than, and it's not a fairy tale. So it's kind of you have to be much more respectful of it, because there is just much more there to deal with. And whether it's Blavatsky or whether it's Casey or whether it's the Freemasons or the Rosicrucians or the Theosophical Society, I mean, they all speak of giants, and we have the evidence here in this country, which blows me away. And the other really cool connection you made, which I was fascinated with, is that the mounds that a lot of these giants, are buried in, and the area around them, they are basically constructed in a very similar manner as to what Atlantis theoretically was constructed as.
Yeah, Greg Little, a friend of mine, he's author of The Mound Builders, Edgar Casey's Forgotten Legacy, where he talks about Casey and the Mound Builders. Greg has a ton of great books. He's a really good researcher and a psychologist by trade. He's the one who originally linked that up. And in Portsmouth, Ohio, in the book, we show the picture of the old engraving done by Squire and Davis that shows this uh, mound work that looks exactly like Plato's description of the central city of Atlantis, and like strikingly similar.
Mm-hmm.
And Casey talked about, archaeologists always wondered like why they laid out, why these mound sites laid out like that, why there moats around all so many of these mound sites. And Casey talks about it was a representation of the central city of Atlantis that the Native Americans would use as, ceremonial pilgrimage sites where they would remember, the homeland essentially, which is kind of fascinating. He said that the mound builders came up from um, actually Mesoamerica, avoiding the sacrifice and the death cults that were happening there. And mound building in the United States started in 3400 BC at Poverty Point, Louisiana. So that's quite a long time ago. But if you read Greg's book, it's this fascinating account of Edgar Casey and Atlantis. And I just, I kind of like take it all in and go with my gut. I'm a uh, kind of a intuition driven detective.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's, just, if you talk to somebody who is a, mainstream archaeologist, they'd be like, there's not a lot of evidence for that or whatever. And I just have this overriding feeling that there is reality to Atlantis, and I always have. And some people must think it's the oddest thing to say, but it's in our memory for a reason. And the whole giant story too. I've studied extensively orthodox archaeological and anthropological theory for about 7 years for now, like intense reading textbooks and lectures, and because I want to know both sides of the story, and I can't be a chump. I have to know both sides of the story here, and I deal with professionals all the time, and I understand the orthodox viewpoints, and I'm not dismissing them, and I'm not saying that archaeology and anthropology is some corrupt arm of a corrupt system. I don't buy that. Monsanto is one thing, but these are just guys doing their job, and I could say, well, you kind of like you're closed-minded about some things, or you're dealing with a level of filtering, but that doesn't mean there's like some conspiratorial agenda that's going on. I don't
Mm-hmm.
see that. That's irrational. But I do see what something. I do see some form of agenda that can preclude some investigation into more controversial subjects. So at the end of the day, I just feel like there's a story here, and I just that's what I get to stick with. Not like believe me or you suck. It's more like I just I just got to tell you what my gut's telling me.
Well, and I think that, it's also been said that at some future point in time, hopefully sooner rather than later, that spirituality and science will come together and work as one. And I think that's, logic and reason does not always apply. And sometimes the truth is just so weird that you back away and say, oh, you must be joking. And yet time and time and time again we've learned that some of the myths, some of the things that we thought were just fables and children's stories turn out to actually be very, very true. So that said, what we look upon as myth now, especially with the giants, a lot of it probably has really sound physical evidence that we just haven't found yet. Because when
Yes,
you know,
there's some thought that we collectively obfuscate the truth from ourselves,
mhm,
and that there's a shared holographic reality where a species with PTSD based on some cataclysmic event that I think has basis in reality. Um, I was just down in Ecuador doing a San Pedro ayahuasca retreat with shamans down there for a couple of weeks, and uh, sit with the shaman for 15 hours on ayahuasca, and you'll easily recognize the interconnectedness of everything in the universe.
I can imagine.
And
We're coming real close up here, I think, to a break. We're going to have a 3-minute break at the top of the hour. So when you hear music coming, don't go away totally, but you'll have 3 minutes, okay?
okay.
But
And yeah, I was
go
going to
ahead.
say about your thoughts about the strangeness of things. Brian Greene has this 4-part special, Fabric of the Cosmos, on PBS about quantum mechanics and quantum theory. And, basically all the quantum theorists agree. Uh, Time is an illusion. There's nothing but an ever present now. When you view something 20 billion light years away, you change it at the subatomic level because it's basically your mind is the projector and it's the universe of time and space is a screen. Thank you.
So much for that. Now I want to kind of get back into this haplogroup. The very first migration of them supposedly was 34,000 years ago, and then the second was about 14,000 years ago. Why did they make 2 migrations?
Um, well, that was, let me think. I'm trying to, is that in Greg Little's book or is
No,
that in the final chapter of our book?
it's the final chapter of your book.
Yeah, because it's not, it's a theory because I don't think an anthropologist would say migration wave happened 34,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
That I would say what is known as a migration wave about 14 or 15,000 years ago, and it's theorized there was one before that. One interesting thing is that the Solutrean theory, Dennis Stanford from the Smithsonian, he's a head of anthropology there. He has this theory that the Solutreans crossed the ice bridge, like island hopping or ice hopping, basically,
Mm-hmm.
like 25,000 years ago, to get to the United States, the east coast of the United States. And he looks at the similarities in tools from the Clovis people in Europe and I'm sorry, the Solutrean people in Europe and the Clovis settlements in the eastern part of the United States. He looks at the fact that the Clovis settlements are predominantly concentrated in the eastern half, and the theory is that they came down the land bridge 15,000 years ago, through Alaska,
Yeah.
then realizing there were a concentration of sites. And he also said there's no antecedent Clovis culture that you find as you travel up north. So he put together this theory, but and one of the points he was making is that haplogroup X is found on both sides of the Atlantic. And now, if you juxtapose that, like we did in the book, and say, well, maybe there was a continent in the middle of the Atlantic that dispersed haplogroup X in both directions. That's the theory, that
Ah.
you find this genetic marker, and like you said, Edgar Cayce said that the Iroquois uh, were of pure Atlantean descent 12,000 years ago, and that
Mm-hmm.
when the continent of Atlantis sank 12,000 years ago, Casey says that the descendants went to different parts of the globe, and that one of the places was the east coast of the United States in the Northeast, and the Iroquois people, who have a high concentration, I think it's like
Mm-hmm.
5% haplogroup X. So it's this really fascinating kind of DNA corroboration of what Casey was saying once again. Casey's been proven right over and over again. Like he claimed the Nile flowed backwards at one point,
Yeah.
and that was proven by satellite imagery. He said that the Essenes had females in their ranks, and that was proven when after his death, when they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that was the case. So he really was, quite proficient in his predictions, and especially about the past. He has a phenomenal accuracy rate. So once again, it's this really interesting thing where genetics seems to be lining up with this strange and controversial story of Atlantis. I mean, what does it mean? What does it mean for humanity that this story persists? And if you listen to Plato, what is the lesson? The lesson is we're replaying what happened there, with these factions of light and dark, and this service to self has taken over, and the good of the service to others has been supplanted by service to the self. So we're headed down the same road, and it's kind of like time for us to wake up.
Yeah, and well, also when you look at what theoretically, I have to keep throwing theoretically in because I can't prove any of it. That the Atlanteans had a consciousness that had evolved far beyond what we have today, and yet you notice that you have people like Madame Blavatsky, and I say that with a chuckle. Edgar Casey, we've got Buddha, we've got Steiner. I mean, there have been voices throughout time that have spoken of these cultures and the level of consciousness, and for the most part, until present time, these seers or prophets, if you will, have been kind of charted up to, they drank too much, they smoked too much, they whatever. But when you look at what they've written over time, it fits in. And I think one of the other things that most of us have been taught that the inhabitants of North America came over the land bridge from Asia. However, I love your other theory that they came from Australia. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there are many different theories, like American Genesis. The Melanesians have Denisovan blood, and once again, the Denisovans are human cousins that mated with Neanderthals and modern humans 40,000 years ago in Siberia. So many human peoples carry a small amount of Denisovan DNA, and most people outside of Africa, I think everyone carries a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. So anyways, the thought is that they basically island hopped to get to, the Denisovans were widespread throughout Asia and made it to Australia. It's a really interesting thing. And then the theory is that they went to the west coast of the United States, that they were seafarers long ago. And it's a really interesting theory. And further genetic testing will answer these questions for us. But once again, it's another theory. And just asking these questions, like how do these stories emerge? What is the possible scenario where we can, put science together with such a controversial notion of lost civilizations and giants and little people? And that was is most fascinating, I think, to me, is that this idea of little people. I've talked to so many Native Americans who tell the same story. It's just like, oh, the elder, the grandfather always talk about, little people. And Lewis and Clark were told by the Native Americans they were afraid to go to Spirit Mountain in South Dakota. And Lewis and Clark went out with armed men because it was reported there was malevolent little people there. It's like there's this story of, it's like Game of Thrones, that this lost world that gets talked about consistently. It's the weirdest thing. Once again, there's a great flood, cataclysmic worldwide flood, cometary impacts, the Broom Star. Let me say this for a second. Why is every native culture afraid of a comet? When we see a comet, it's like, wow, it's so pretty. That's a cool astronomical event. It is feared worldwide. The Broom Star, the bringer of doom. And now I understand, after you read Graham Hancock's book, it's because it has been a bringer of doom. So you have little people, giants, advanced civilizations. This whole story is basically told all around the world, in religious documents and oral traditions. And yeah, wow, it's so strange that you have this lost world that is talked about, and then a totally different theory that flies in the face of it, that contradicts that at every turn, and vehemently too, as if to adhere to that notion is you're like a religious freak, or a new ager that has no sensibility, something like that. Like, it's, you can't even entertain those ideas. It's such a divergent reality.
Well, it just, in looking at all of this information, I mean, the mound builders, um, theoretically at least had some giants within their culture,
Yeah, yeah,
because,
yeah.
and were they the mound builders? I mean, if you look at all of the megalithic structures around the world, and you put giants into the mix, it makes it seem a lot more logical that we could have built a lot of these huge, the megalithic buildings, because, and I'm not talking just 7, 8 feet tall. I mean, historically speaking, some of them went 15, 20 feet tall. And if you have that kind of giant, like the one you talked about, he could pick up a ton with no problem at all.
There are connections, whether it's mountain sites or megalithic sites. Stonehenge, the Giant's Dance. The oldest representation is a textile in the 12th century that shows Merlin and a normal sized guy along with the giant who's building Stonehenge. Uh, you can chalk it up to the superstition, but the consistency of giants be associated with these sites all around the world. I think there are some sites that um, harken back to another time, basically. That I think we got the dates of Stonehenge pinned down pretty well. The post holes were laid in, probably 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, but 2,500 years ago for the rings at Stonehenge. We have the dates of a lot of places down, but we don't have the dates down for, I think, places like Sacsayhuaman, Pumapunku.
Hmm.
There are other sites around the planet that I think are remnants from another age, quite frankly. A lot of sites in South America. And then we have, once again, we have a 12,000-year-old temple site in Turkey, in Indonesia at Gunung Padang, that may be 15, 20,000 years old. We still will know in the next couple of years. The point is that these sites exist quite possibly from another age, and they all have these associations with giants. It's, once again, a strange thing, because I don't want to sound like, I'm dismissing all contrary evidence. I'm just basically trying to take it all in and look at it like a comparative mythologist and say, I don't want to, right, this is the theory, this is the way it is. I just want to offer a different viewpoint that isn't based on just a bunch of data, where
Hmm.
and the data is necessary and I understand it. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying it doesn't hold weight. I'm saying there is a strange alternative story that is supported by what is looked at as like a sacred oral transmission, of
Hmm.
knowledge, whether it's the Freemasons or Rosicrucians who would never pass erroneous information to the initiates, or oral traditions of indigenous people who have like trained females who have to remember every last word. It's like it's just it's from a more pure wellspring, if you will, that I feel that these traditions are being transmitted, rather than the vicissitudes of science and the agendas and everything like that. Not that it doesn't have its place. Once again, I'm just kind of offering this other story that is repeated over and over again.
Well, that's why I found your book spectacular, because you do go into great detail on a lot of these different possibilities. And I think that one of the other fascinating things that you talked about was that in the mounds they found, especially they found a jar of seeds that had to be, I don't know how many thousands of years old, but when they planted them, they found that the crops that they grew were so much richer and more abundant than the crops that are built today, and that they possibly had, what did you call it? Secret energy science that
Yeah,
that
lost
that,
energy science.
yeah, that could put an electromagnetic charge into something to enhance it. And they found, actually with stone chambers, they found that you could do that with some seeds, that you could put seeds in the chambers, and that after a period of time, if you planted them, they were able to produce crops that were more abundant than had you just opened a packet of burpee seeds and thrown them in the ground.
Yeah, it was Halberg and Burke, Seed of Plenty. I forget the name of the book, but yes, they did tests, similar tests, indicating that there is this kind of lost, um, plant science or energy science that helps things grow. And there are several of those accounts you mentioned. The one in the book is it said grew in spite of age, and it
Mm-hmm.
was from a burial mound like 60 feet down into it. They found an 8.5 foot skeleton with a jar that was sealed, a cask that was sealed, and they planted the corn, and it was an outrageous yielder. And then there were other accounts, Indiana's freak corn, Illinois, Ohio, where they found these jars of corn, and then the farmers planted them, and they were just outrageous yielders, which begs the question, you know, is there, I guess there's a lot of different theories about the way you lay things out in design, geometric forms, or how you enchant the landscape with stones or earth or different organic materials. And basically, Ross Hamilton talks about this, that the ancient landscape was a generator of benevolent energy, if you will, where uh, he theorizes that crops would grow large, taller, people would grow taller, and there was kind of peace and prosperity throughout the land. And that is kind of a universal theory, and it is, hypothesized that people around the world did this sort of thing. This tapped in where the shamans and the medicine men would direct people to build things in a particular way, uh, to basically generate, etheric power, if you will, like
Mm-hmm.
something Stonehenge was built like that. And I tend to agree. You go to different sites, and I went to Glastonbury tour, and I was just blown away. It was like stepping through a multi-dimensional doorway, and I was at Hugh's house in Glastonbury, and I'm a pretty dense guy, but I'll tell you that something to that spot, and I've been other places too where I have the same feeling. And
Did you go to Avery?
Avebury, yes, yes,
I mean,
unbelievable.
certain of those stones radiate. I mean, you can feel the energy, and it can be a cleansing energy. It can be a rejuvenating energy. I mean, there is earth energy. There is such a thing of it. People who talk about earthing. The earth has a heartbeat, a rhythm, a pulsation. And if you stand in your bare feet on the earth long enough every day, you can synchronize your own energetic field with that of the earth. And it helps to, oh gosh, decrease inflammation and all sorts of stuff. So that energetics, I mean, heck, wearing magnetic bracelets, if they're more than 5,000 Gauss magnets, does help to enhance the flow of blood through your body, and it helps to polarize the blood cells as they flow through your veins. I mean, there is such great validity in the natural aspects that are connected to the earth that we have lost touch with. and in looking at the giants and the size of their skulls and kind of figuring, okay, they had brains that were that much bigger, and DNA wise, we don't use all of the strands of DNA that we have. The scientists call most of them junk DNA, but in reality, I really feel that we carry our own hall of records with us, and that in those strands of DNA that we haven't been able to activate are the answers to a lot of these questions, and possibly the memory of the history of our species.
Yes, I agree, and I agree with your thoughts about the Earth. It's 7.83 is the hertz, the resonance of the Earth, and uh, it is a proof that our culture has things upside down. What we value is screwed up. The way we pollute the planet. I mean, just if you like were hovering above this planet and the concrete, the pollution, the cities, the global warming, the nuclear arsenals, the constant warring, you would just shake your head and like, what the hell is wrong with these people? And you have to, our science is rooted in that. That is a part of our science. Like, you know, I'm rebuilding the walls on my road on Bug Hill Road here in Ashfield. My brother and I, 2 mile long stretch. We've been at it since last year, kind of doing it just to, beautify the property or the, basically the for the town, for the good of
Mhm.
everyone. But you're out there and it's just like, oh, that has no utility. Like art has no utility. It has to, you have to produce something. There has to be something measurable financially or whatever. And it's all like you said, that you're out by a waterfall sitting, or you're down the beach, and anybody can feel that, can understand that nature, that the earth is a living being, and even that like idea gets ridiculed, like it's, oh, that's new agey or something. It's like, basically, the more you identify with that culture, the more screwed you are. You are aligning with insanity, and you don't want to spend all your time railing against it, but in your own life, you have to, create a world that's the antithesis of what we see. And I find a lot of people will spend their time fighting and getting in this conspiratorial mindset. But like Socrates said, don't spend any of your time fighting the old, just create the new. And I do that in my life where, like I said, we built stone towers all around town and art projects and clean the woods and volunteer efforts to like kind of make a Lord of the Rings environment where we live, and plant flowers and everything like that. Like, do what you love,
Mhm.
basically, and create something beautiful for everyone. And don't waste all your time, just battling with trolls or trying to prove a case or whatever. Just more like, let your intuition guide you, and do something for the good of all.
Yeah, and I think this book is spectacular because and I really I don't rave about books that much. I will say I liked it or I enjoyed it, but I think what you've done is put so much material out there for people to sit and look at and check out and question, and it's sort of like you've given them a lot of the building blocks. Whether or not they build a bridge or a barrier, it's up to them. But what you've done is given them the building blocks, which is really phenomenal. I mean, and I'm sure there are lots of theories you haven't hit on. You did go into the Nephilim and the biblical giants and all of that. I still haven't figured out. They didn't just pop up a whole race of giants. They had to come from somewhere. They had to um, have evolved somewhere because of something. I don't think they were extraterrestrials. I really believe that they were indigenous to the planet, but I can't figure out where they came from.
No, it's a great point. And people want answers and they want theories. But all I can, I can, in the book, we cover some of the different potential theories. I like to keep the flame going for the time when the ideas are more well received. And it's basically, I'm trying to just to get people to think differently, to look at more non-conventional sources of information, like I said, like oral traditions, the accounts of early explorers, historical documents from the past.
Well, just about every one of the explorers that hit this country wrote about the giants that were here, that were either tribes of them or were intermixed into the indigenous people that were here. So back when we were being discovered, not that we were lost, but that they were here. And my thought is they probably were at that time in decline, you know, because there were so many other smaller people. But there was a time when this continent, I do believe, was ruled by giants, tribes of giants.
Yeah, the explorers, the conventional thought is, oh, the Spanish average 5'3", and the Native Americans were, 5'10", 5'11", sometimes, and they considered them giants. And if you read the accounts, that's not what they're saying. They're pretty specific, where from Magellan, Coronado, Vespucci, John Smith, John Lawson, DeSoto, every explorer you can name, Francis Drake, reported like giant people, giant tribal chiefs from Patagonia to Virginia to
Mm-hmm.
Florida to Texas, and it was like this giant on his knees towered over all our men. They're talking about one account is in a parade in Mexico, a 9 foot tall giant was there. They're given specific measurements,
Mm-hmm.
talking about Tuscaloosa, who ruled the Alabama territory, and him and his son were both reported to be 7.5 feet and maybe even taller, and like enormous uh, people here. So I don't know. And then we have photographs of 7'4" Ona people and a 6'6" woman at the turn of the century, the 19th century, that Captain Cook took, and
Mm-hmm.
just, yeah, troops decimated those people, and uh, well, the indigenous people were basically lost to time. And I'm asking the question: if you read through all these accounts in the book, uh, did anthropology miss something because it wasn't really looking for it, and it just kind of ignored so many accounts, and the skeletal remains? Once again, there are so many accounts of these. Bones are on display, and now where are they all? And I'm not even saying, oh, it's some vast conspiracy. I'm just saying, if they're 5'7", then I want the documents or the photographs that this skeleton that everybody in the freaking town ranted and raved about was 5'7", and they were all delusional. It's like, what is the other side of this? Like, thousands of people lied in a very specific way for no perceived gain through decades of time in an era of inefficient communication. It just doesn't make any sense. That's illogical too, and not too, but the other side could say, like, if there were a reality to this, there would be more physical evidence. And I understand that, but geez, at every turn, I'm just trying to, like, okay, where are the bones from this dig site? Oh, we lost the skull. The Maryland Academy of Sciences, the
Mm-hmm.
oldest scientific institution in the country. I didn't cover this in the book, but I talked to Linda Jo Nelson, the head of records, and John Widgeon, African American naturalist, wired together like 7.5 to 8 foot tall skeletons at the Franklin Street office. And I showed her the accounts. I'm like, do you know where these bones went? And she was digitizing all the records. She could find no record of it. She said, I'm astounded. This Widgeon, is a well known naturalist. They were installed right here, where I work. I can't find a whiff of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, if they're 5'7", then at least that I want to know, what I'm saying? Instead, so many times I just can't find. And that's what's frustrating. And that's what the debunker doesn't realize. They just like dismiss it as hocus pocus. And I'm like, yeah, you dig into this and, make a strong case, because I have not been able to, you know,
Well,
get to the bottom. Yeah.
a lot of the bones were so old that when they hit the atmosphere, they just crumbled.
It's funny. I did a TEDx talk, and it got taken off the internet. That was mostly because I started to go off on the Koch brothers funding the Smithsonian for their um,
That was a great video, by the way. I saw it before they took it down.
they pumped in like $50 million into these exhibits that basically obfuscate the truth about global climate change. So
Hmm.
I was ranting and raving. I was all pissed off at the end. And but the moral of the story is that I was talking about so many accounts, including Smithsonian ethnology reports, honestly report that the bones, when exposed to the air, crumble to dust, and they have on their own records, like I said, 36-inch circumference skulls in Illinois,
Hmm.
7 foot tall skeleton with a huge skull in Florida, and doctors or scientists, they're looking at them, they crumble to dust, and what do you say to that, man? You just specific measurements, and then they crumble away to dust, and it's not. I didn't make it up. These scientists aren't making it up. It's something that happened. It's an unfortunate, but it's in their records. These things just never been addressed. Like it's always like some debunker dude or some troll is like trying to be the gatekeeper of science. And, I understand there's a lot of like internet garbage out there that has no merit. But when something is um, like this that really deserves a further investigation doesn't get looked at, or you have some a-hole just running their mouth that you want to put their head through a wall, like like certain debunkers, they're not scientists who are trying to look at the problem. It's like I
Well,
would like there are many things that need a second look. That's what I'm saying. And I feel it hasn't happened. And I feel there are a lot of theories out there that like ancient aliens, like aliens didn't build the pyramids, you know what I mean? Or they didn't build Puma Punku. It's just like a catchy show that gets good ratings. So they keep aliens and whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like
well,
that yeah.
a lot of this stuff, though. I mean, you look at you again. I get into my rant here about the negligence and the apathy that we as Americans seem to have. We will pay fortunes for people to go over and to dig in Egypt, cautiously looking for tombs and stuff like that. When right here in this country, we've got mounds that may be even older than the Egyptian pyramids. And instead of taking a look at what we've got here, I mean, ground penetrating radar and stuff like that, to maybe not have to actually dismantle. There are still mounds out there that have not been excavated, and I'm not saying excavate them all, but it got to the point in the 1800s, especially when they saw the mounds, they knew they were a burial site, and they dug in to just get the artifacts and to throw the bones away. And some of these giants were buried sitting up, facing west, I think, west or east. I forget which, but they were facing one direction.
Yes, in a seated position facing the east, which, once again, there are many of these accounts. It was kind of a little known Native American burial technique. In his buried in a sitting position facing the east. Now, a lot of these giant accounts talk about that specific burial technique, which indicates that they were human burials
Hmm.
and they were Native American burials, and that they um, really strongly indicate that the report is true because you're not just going to, if you're making up a hoax, you wouldn't know this obscure burial technique or like spokes of a whale and these other things. So, you know, the only thing it could be, this mystery could be, if it's not true, is something that measurement is bizarrely out of place, like the unbelievable inability to measure bones, because nothing else, mastodons, hoaxes, none of that carries weight. So it all boils down to that would be the only argument that could dissuade somebody away from believing this is a reality. And once again, that's usually oh, these are hoaxes, these are mastodon bones. No, they're not. And that's what kind of got me so into it, because I was dismissed as a crank, and I'm like, no, you're out of your mind. Like there are so many credible accounts here. And I will say that the burial position of sitting uh, seated facing east was found in Egypt. That style burial a couple of years ago. They found a 35,000-year-old female skeleton in Egypt. So that's interesting that that burial technique has been passed through the ages to land up in the United States and used by Native Americans. I think the belief is that the soul travels to the east, so they bury somebody like that. But there's a 30,000-year-old skeleton that was buried seated facing east, which is interesting.
Well, isn't it also facing the rising sun as well?
Uh, what is it? Sun rises in the east, sets in the west.
Yep.
Is that right?
From the east to the west, yes.
Yes, I would say if any of your listeners have an interest, I read Greg Little's Path of Souls. It's about, actually, he talks about giant skeletons in the mounds and gives a really sober look at the controversy. But it's about Native American death rituals, and it's really interesting. Yeah.
Well, and a lot of the tools that were found in some of these mounds and these graves, the tools were huge. And I think it's in Europe that they found an axe that was so high, so tall that it was hard for a single man to lift it. And it was not meant to be wall art. I'm pretty sure it was meant to be a weapon. And the tools and the jewels. What I found fascinating was that there were several, and I believe they were mounds where when the giant was uncovered, they were surrounded by hundreds or thousands of freshwater pearls.
Yes, pearls and copper crowns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the were kings and queens. It was buried in royal fashion. It was really, or it is really, just a fascinating part of Native American culture was, the sophistication of their engineering and their, I mean, God, there's just so many things that, I don't want to be the human dictionary, but from Poverty Point to Cahokia to Aztalan and Grave Creek and all these sites, amazing feats of engineering. What's found in the mounds is beautifully sophisticated, carved implements and copper and pipes and just, we mentioned some in the book. There's beautiful stuff. I have a 30-pound stone axe with me right now, actually, that this guy, Brock Smith, Hugh met him at a conference, and he sent it. We did a video, but a 30-pound stone axe head I have, just like the one in the book. That was considered the largest in the world at the time. But I will say that there are many accounts where a giant skeleton was found with giant implements. Make of it what you will, but you can, a 30-pound axe head. I can't wield this thing. I'm a stonemason, and there's no way I could swing it. And a couple of years ago, Oxford scientists at the oldest level of a basin in South Africa found 4 giant stone axes, like 12 inches long, giant, amongst 10,000 normal-sized artifacts. And the thought is like, oh, that's a ceremonial object. And that's, that's a theoretical possibility. I would say that there are many accounts, though, with these giant implements buried with giant people. And once again, I have the axe I have is from Illinois, found in a burial mound about 100 years ago. And it's absolutely enormous, just a beautiful object. But
well, being female and not so much into rocks, my fascination was, where did they get that many freshwater pearls?
Well, in the original Hopewell Mound opened by Warren K. Moorhead in the late 1800s, they found obsidian from Wyoming, silver from Canada, shells from the Gulf Coast. Basically, every part of the country, their trade goods were found in this one burial mound, showing that ancient America was this vast highway. And I believe the freshwater shells came from the coasts of Georgia and Florida, if I'm not mistaken.
Now, you're saying ancient. How?
Yes.
ancient is
To
old, but how many thousands of years ago?
the Hopewell people 2,000 years ago, the Adena 2,500, 3,000 years ago, that they lived in the Ohio River Valley. And then the Mississippian culture lasted, it was more like 700 AD till about 1500 AD. They were the kind of the pyramid builders, the latest or the last of the mound builders, the Mississippians at Sparrow Mound in Oklahoma, Cahokia in Missouri, Moundville in Alabama. They were the Aztalan in Wisconsin, the
What
creator of those sites.
what about the Catalina Island and the Santa Rosa giants? They date back further than that, though, don't they?
Well, the oldest human remains in the United States, I believe, are two femur bones found in the Catalina Island Channel,
Mm-hmm.
13,000 years old. So the human remains there are quite old, and all the islands, you have reports from the 1800s on of enormous skeletons being found, and reports of the native people being exceptionally tall once again. And Catalina Island, we went to there for the show, and man, that place creeped me out. The amateur archaeologist Ralph Glidden was a grave robber, and he desecrated all these sites. He recorded quite a few enormously tall skeletons, 28-inch femur and 7.5 feet, and on and on and on. But I just felt that he was just a grave robbing lunatic at the end, and my brother and I had nightmares the night before we left there, and I just want to get the hell out of Catalina. But it was looked at as an island where the shamans were like incredible wizards with supernatural powers. It was always portrayed as a place of spiritual power and mystery. But all the islands reported the same things, in all the scientific journals of the times, and these adventurers chronicling them and digging up bones in St. Nicholas. And it's just once again a wild story that it's like you want dates, but you need evidence to date,
Yeah, and it's hard to actually, unless you have something to carbon date, it's hard to know exactly what you're talking about.
Yes, I will interject and say, though, one of the pictures in the book at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, 1959, there are a number of skeletons, several over 7 foot tall, in the burial pit, and the carbon date is 7,070. So it's like 5,000 BC, basically. And there were several of those skeletons, and they had red ochre painted on the skulls that were over 7 foot tall, much like so many other reports around there. So that's from the Santa Barbara Museum in 1959, a credible report. And I would assume, you're going back 10,000 years ago on those islands at least.
I find it so sad that our history books, first of all, don't go into this at all, and that we have all of these amazing historical sites here that people honestly aren't even aware of. And you talk about giants and people kind of raise their eyebrows and just look at you, but the reality is there's absolute proof out there that they existed. They were here, and they were here in huge numbers. It wasn't just an anomaly, or somebody got born and was really big. When the South Korea guy died and his son took over, Kim, whatever he is,
Kim Jong-un, North Korea.
There was a picture of his army lining up to honor him, and Patrick spotted it. I didn't, but when you looked at the army, you saw, everybody is about the same size, same size, and then whoops, there's one huge person that is like twice the size of everybody else, and then same size. So I do feel that genetically it's in our DNA that we come from them, and I don't know how. I don't know, but where did they come from? I mean, you have migrations from Australia. You have migrations from, I know stories about how they were, chased out of the Holy Land into Europe, chased out of Europe into Ireland and whatever, and then they left Ireland and they followed the ice pack, or the ice, not the ice pack, but yeah, they
Land bridge.
yeah, and came from Europe into the Americas, and if there was no one here then, if it was then just one great big forest and you're welcome to it, I get the feeling that they spent thousands of years here. And then there was a migration from Asia, and then then they intermingled, and then clearly something happened and we got smaller.
Yeah, it's funny because I just want to. I don't want to be attached to anything. Like, I just want to put out information, and I say that because if I'm like the giant guy or whatever, it's just like I have to like. When I first got into the subject, I kind of happened by accident, just reading through town and county histories, looking for stone accounts from the early settlers encountering pre-colonial stonework. Um, I got so much heat for, like, I thought, like, oh, this is really interesting. People like that. We know a lot of people enjoy this, like, historical detective work in this literature, but I just caught a bunch of heat, and I felt like it's on me to, like, prove this. I got in a defensive posture, like I have to prove this case, and then I got to the point. I'm like, no, I don't have to. I just think it's worthy of further investigation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's difficult to create a coherent theory, and I know that leaves some people disappointed. For me, it's more like uh, present the information, present the different theories,
Mm-hmm.
present science and the esoteric versions of it, and just kind of like what resonates with you, what makes sense, because
Well,
it's a
and
tough, yeah.
I totally respect that. I have to jump to conclusions, um, but maybe that's for the next generation. Maybe people like you putting out all of these different theories and these different possibilities will catch and fascinate somebody much younger who will use technology so much better than what we have, and be able to make connections. I frankly think that every single one of the theories you've got has some validity, and they probably all have validity, and the actual truth is a combination of them all, plus other facets of understanding that we haven't really linked up to yet. But I think personally, speaking from my modality, there's a level of consciousness connected to all of it too, that 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 will help that awareness kind of weave it all together so that there's a greater understanding. I don't think humanity's at that place in time yet.
No, no, definitely not. Well, I think that's a good point, and that's how I feel. It's kind of like a modern day Charles Fort. Like, yeah, I think if Hugh and I were overbearing in our book, like, then it'd be kind of a turn off to some people. I think more just to keep alive all this cool historical documentation mixed with oral traditions, mixed with explorers' accounts and mystics, and just like this is what all these sources are saying about giants. It's kind of encyclopedia of
Mm-hmm.
different sources, and it's just kind of keeping alive this odd and controversial subject, and see what happens. See if there's new anthropological finds that support it in the future. See if there's new evidence, and that's what I like to do. I think there are many things that haven't been properly investigated. Was there ancient machining at different sites around the world? Was there a worldwide cataclysm? Was there a pre-ice age advanced civilization? Was there a cometary impact? Were there little people? You know, the like I could write a whole little people book, like all these accounts of skeletons of like dwarfs that were found, you know, and
Hmm.
uh, just the same thing once again, meeting up with oral tradition. So I feel like I want like science and history and these things to be interesting to people, and kind of fun and intriguing. And it's like a gateway drug to get like kids in to, because I think anthropology and archaeology are fascinating. I frankly believe in most of orthodox theories,
Hmm.
but the thing is, there are some big ones that I kind of like. I really think there's another story,
Well,
and that's yeah.
you've taken you have some scientific absolutes here. You know, some of your haplo X group, and you know there are a lot of things here that are scientifically valid that can be proven, and you've presented them in a way so that they dovetail into the legends, so that you see the two together and connected where they have never been before. I mean, even down to the electromagnetic stuff being connected to, giants, and looking at the seeds and then thinking, well, if the electromagnetic energy could do that to the seeds, couldn't it do that to the human species that were there at that present time too? So I mean, you've put things out so people will question and put things together and say, what if? And I truly believe that's what makes your book so brilliant, because people sit back and they start to postulate, and that means they start to think. And if you can make people think, you have absolutely served your purpose.
Excellent. You're singing my tune. I'm really glad that you enjoy the book and you've given it such a glowing review. I really, Hugh and well, I got the 2 minute warning sign about a minute ago, so I guess from Sean. So
Yeah.
I'll give a conclusion right here that yeah, that once again is my goal, just to you know I always loved fascinating mystery stories when I was a kid, and I try to make a real one here where I'm just taking like real historical evidence and weaving it into a fascinating tale, and people can make up their own minds. And I think if you're logical and reasonable, you will see that it's quite an interesting story. So,
Okay.
well, yep.
Yes, thank you so much, Jim. This was great. Like I said, 2 minutes, 2 hours isn't long enough.
Thanks for having me on, Barbara. You take care.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye bye.